On a gray October day in 1921, T.S. Eliot sat hunched on a wooden bench at the Nayland Rock Shelter at Margate, staring out over the deserted winter sands. His health had crumbled, his marriage to Vivienne was brittle, and the modern world, shattered by war and disillusion, seemed as fragmented as his own thoughts. And with a pencil in hand and the sea before him, he began scrawling lines that would become part of the wasteland. On Margate sands, I connect nothing with nothing. These words, scratched out in anguish, were not merely poetic. They were also diagnostic. And Eliot was breaking down. At that moment on the shore was not only a cry for coherence, but this audible note of a poem that would eventually echo throughout the century. A month later, in November 1921, Eliot stood on a Paris railway platform as his wife Vivienne watched him depart for Switzerland. Behind him lay a wrecked body and mind, an emotional detachment, or derangement as he called it, driven to collapse not by overwork, but by years of psychic unrest. Ahead lay Lausanne, where the poet sought cure from Dr. Roger Vitotes, and brought with him fragments of a poem. And in the foggy quiet of the Hotel Pension Stelus, he began to reshape those fragments. And while Europe slid toward disorder, Eliot, cut off from London and his wife and almost everything familiar, wrote sections of The Wasteland, including What the Thunder Said. He was writing a poem, and he was writing himself back into coherence. When The Wasteland was published in December 1922, poetry was never the same again. Edmund Wilson said that it enchanted and devastated a whole generation. Ezra Pound said that Eliot's poem was almost enough to make all the other poets shut up shop. Harold Bloom would eventually say that this was the most influential poem written in English in the 20th century. But what drove Eliot to write this complex, fragmented work? And how does something like The Wasteland come into existence? To answer that question, we need to see how his exquisite poetry is connected to his own personal crises and that of the modern world. In the process, I'll highlight some passages from The Wasteland in which these crises seem to be encoded in the poem. So first, let's look at what led up to the event of writing The Wasteland. So between 1919 and 1922, Eliot endured what he would later call his years of hell. The death of his father in 1919 really instigated all of this. It was a deep sorrow that he had, steeped in guilt for not having achieved success, and feeling like he hadn't lived up to his father's ideals. This loss of his father also coincided with his marriage crisis with Vivienne Haigh-Wood. She was a woman beset by chronic illness and mental instability, and their household became a place of emotional volatility. Writing to his brother, Eliot once confessed that his life felt like a cage of circumstances. And his letters to other family members suggest that his devotion to Vivienne emerged more from a sense of duty and obligation than of love. Eliot insisted that The Wasteland was not autobiographical. He wanted to really insist upon this as critics began picking up the poem after it was published. And we should keep that in mind. We should keep in mind that when we're close reading a poem, the reader should focus first on what is within the poem, not what is outside of it. But once you've achieved an innocent reading of the poem, once you've really experienced it without notes, then you can go back and try to understand how it came to be. And that's what I'm going to do in this lecture now. Poetry emerges not so much from culture, but from consciousness. And there are moments wherein we can see glimpses of Eliot's consciousness in this poem. Eliot himself later commented that some forms of illness are extremely conducive to artistic and literary composition. He suggested that his psychological state was immediately connected to the creative process that produced the poem, and he has a couple other comments like this as well. More tellingly, Eliot made a chilling retrospective statement about the poem being born from marital difficulties. suggesting that the marriage brought no happiness, but it produced what he said was the state of mind that produced The Wasteland. So although this is not an autobiographical poem, the poem trembles with the anguish of his marriage and his own fragile psychic state. So if you turn to a game of chess, for instance, there are scenes which capture the claustrophobic and emotional paralysis of the marriage itself. There are those lines, "My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me." We can almost hear Vivienne in these lines. "Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak," she urges. And we don't know who's speaking in the poem, but we know from this context that it's likely a conversation that Vivienne had with Eliot. This neurotic entreaty is mirroring Vivienne's diary entries. It's riddled with anxiety, guilt, and confusion, and this urging for Eliot to share more of himself. Lyndall Gordon and others have noted that Vivienne helped type early drafts of the poem and shaped its tone, not only by influencing it, but also by her presence. So the cold detachment in the speaker's voice mimics Eliot's coping mechanism to withdraw into silence. And that you can just see how perfectly that creates the tension in the marriage itself. Her wanting connection, and that only causing him to withdraw further. And in this way, the poem functions as an exorcism of personal torment. It encodes these intimate collapses into public poetic form. These are very intimate and private, but the poem itself kind of has that dimension to it. So apart from the couple's individual psychological stress, there was also the pain of Vivienne's past adultery. And this was a sore subject for Eliot, as one might understand. By 1922, there were several years separating Vivienne's adultery. Vivienne had actually slept with Eliot's old professor, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher. And Eliot had tried to love her again and failed, and even having a pointless and short-lived fling of his own, but it was tough for them both because of this. And Vivienne's infidelity, and perhaps more likely his own infidelity in trying to kind of balance the scales, may tinge the opening lines of the poem, which are fraught with sexual disgust. "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring the dull roots with spring rain." There's this elemental promiscuity, the absence of any meaning or love in this elemental promiscuity of the dead land betrays perhaps a personal disgust for sexual relations and how those relations are in a way tainted for Eliot, at least in this stage of his consciousness. And in 1921, Eliot began writing The Wasteland in earnest. This is when he started drafting first 2 sections by May, and his work was interrupted by a summer visit from family members, which created more tension as he had to manage the testy relations of his elderly mother and his chronically ill wife. The two did not really get along. So Eliot reached this psychic exhaustion from that summer visit. His family kind of exacerbated the already strained domestic atmosphere, and he succumbed to what he termed the total loss of will. The strain contributed to Eliot's suffering and nervous breakdown in the autumn of 1921, and this breakdown required 3 months of leave from his job at Lloyd's Bank. So he sought treatment in Lausanne, Switzerland, under Dr. Robert Vitotz, a pioneer neurological doctor in certain kinds of therapy, and it seems like it was actually really successful, because it was here in this retreat from worldly demands where Eliot began shaping the poem that would change poetry forever. Eliot described later The Wasteland as, quote, "the relief of a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life, a rhythmical lament born of psychological distress." Yet Ezra Pound, through rigorous editing, the first draft of The Wasteland is totally different from what we have now. It was probably twice the length. Ezra Pound transformed this deeply personal lament into the modernist epic of cultural despair. So critics are aware of the poem's autobiographical core, that it emerges from this psychological stress. And they've noted that the original drafts revealed more overt signs of Eliot's emotional breakdown, especially through excised sections that exposed themes of sexual failure, disorientation, and collapse, spiritual collapse, psychic collapse. So it's there in the early drafts, and some of that was excised by Hound. So we can see how even the remnants of what is the Wasteland, the great poem in its edited form, there are still those remnants of the personal connections. So Eliot's breakdown in 1921 marked both an end and a beginning, and the collapse of his inner instability, and the birth of his greatest work. The man described himself as a living double or triple life, emerged from Lausanne, Switzerland, altered but not undone. It was a moment of great change for him. And the Wasteland stands as a testimony to a ruined civilization. Yes, it's often viewed as that, but it's also a monument to a soul piecing back together itself from amid the wreckage. I think that's partly what gives the Wasteland its enduring life. I mean, this is a poem that has just attracted and drawn people to for over 100 years now. The poem emerged from inspiration, and it also emerged from this therapeutic reordering of his own psychic debris. I mean, you read the poem, and if you're used to the more classical style of Victorian classicism or even Romanticism, or of the poetry of Pope in the 18th century, you might come to this poem and think, this is so fragmented and frustrating. How do I make meaning out of this? And the meaning is there, and the frustration is a part of the poem. So if you're frustrated, you're actually reading it correctly. Just surrender to that experience and try not to interrogate the poem too hard or too aggressively. You really need to surrender to it. It resists aggression. So in fact, Eliot wrote part of the poem in some kind of trance, especially the section, What the Thunder Said. He said that this part was composed in a trance or an unconscious state. You can call it channeling, call it possession by the muse, but this portion of the poem seems to have come together the fastest immediately following the rest cure in Switzerland. He met Ezra Pound. Eliot said that, quote, he placed before him in Paris the manuscript of the sprawling, chaotic poem called The Wasteland, which left his hands reduced to about half its size, in the form of which it appears today in print. So Eliot wrote The Wasteland from this personal need to put back the fragments of his own mind, of his own spirit, we might say. But it also did more than that. He was writing for the world as well. We can see Eliot's state of mind as a microcosm for the world at large of what was actually going on in post the Great War Europe. The poem was published at the end of the most significant year for English literature in the past 100 years or so. 1922 considered a point of no return in literary history, because it wasn't just Eliot's The Wasteland. That year saw the publication of Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, and the English translation of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And then, if that weren't enough for 1 year, Eliot's poem comes in right at the end as the coup de grace of poetry as we knew it. Poetry in English would just never be the same again after that. But more importantly, 1922 represented what some scholars call the first real post-war year. When the loss and devastation from the Great War had sunk in, it took some time for people to grapple with what life was like after this war. Unexpectedly, what brought this one was the disappearance of the indication of war. War restrictions were abolished, and civilians kind of just returned back to the new normal, the way life was when Europe was emerging from the most devastating conflict it had ever known. And it was a war that claimed millions of lives and shattered long-held beliefs about progress, optimism, civilization, and human nature. I mean, after that war, people were really having to come to grips with what exactly is humankind? And that would happen again with the Second World War. But it was strange to go back to a new normal with such absence, which so much had changed. In 1922, people were wrestling with that. The immediate post-war period of 1918 up to 1922 had witnessed, one, the collapse of empires and the redrawing of national boundaries, two, some serious social and political upheaval. Benito Mussolini had become the Prime Minister of Italy. There was the formation of the Irish Free State, which W.B. Yeats had a hand in. And third, there was the deep psychological trauma that permeated European consciousness. It is as though the people who had endured the war with hope and consolation that once this is all over, we can go back to the way things were suddenly struck with the realization that you can never go back to the way things were. And the post-World War I world was speaking, and it was saying you can never go back. The Great War helped inaugurate what's called the modern age. Looking back, this is the label that scholars have put on it. It was as though the trenches of the war had been dug through time itself, and they ruptured the past impassively from the present. Such a world demands new language, new symbols, new forms of expression, and that's what's new about modernism. In my past lecture, I talked about how it's actually connected and in dialogue with the past and with tradition. But it was also a break from tradition. One's relationship to literature and history would have changed too. I mean, can you imagine being a reader after the Great War and returning to the great Romantic or Victorian lyrics? They don't hit the same way after that. And this is the important part. The Romantic poetry of hope and spiritual vision, the Victorian poetry of chaste emotion and firm belief in the progress of history, had become insufficient, glaringly so. Imagine surviving the horrors of the First World War to return home to your bookshelf where Keats's poetry sits, and taking down the old treasured volume, reading an ode to a Grecian urn. As a poem, it is completely insufficient for addressing the obliterating and remorseless destruction endured for years in the trenches. And that's no fault of Keats or the Romantics. We can still enjoy their poetry, but their poetry doesn't speak to the condition of the modern mind. Their poetry isn't supposed to do all of that. But the dissonance one would feel in taking up a volume of poetry from the past century would have certainly been a despairing experience. Little of past literature acknowledged the gaping wound of the present. There were no old instruments to play the dirge of the modern age. All the looking glasses were broken. Literature needed something new. It needed to give voice to the insane condition of modernity, of the modern human being. And the poetry of the past didn't do that. Poetry was mute and injured, like Philomel. And it was modernism, and especially Eliot's The Wasteland, that gave her a voice again. And that's partly why Eliot had to write The Wasteland, and why it was so successful.